Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this week's episode of Horns, we take a look at one of the most challenging aspects of the U.S. tradition of peaceful transition of power: how to pass sensitive and classified national security matters from one administration to the next, when the administrations may have differing priorities and perhaps even be of different parties. Stephen Hadley, who served as National Security Advisor under President George W. Bush from 2005 to 2009, is now the co-editor of a volume entitled Handoff: Foreign Policy George W. Bush Passed to Barack Obama. This volume collects decision memoranda which were prepared by NSC members in advance of the election, before they even knew who the victor would be, to prepare the next administration to take on a variety of policy issues. In addition to the memoranda and their enclosures, many of which were declassified at the request of President Bush many years before they would otherwise have seen public eye, the volume includes reflections by the principals who helped to prepare them and execute the policies, as well as essays analyzing the policies and the transition. This is a fascinating historical resource and an interesting discussion which serves both as a retrospective on the foreign policy of the George W. Bush administration, which included many critical and at times controversial elements that have helped to define American policy today, and also on the process of the transition of presidential power. This discussion was held at the University of Texas, Austin on Valentine's Day of this year. Let's listen in.
Steve, tell us about the origins of these transition memos. Something that's known, fairly well within the business, but may seem, foreign to other Americans who are not used to this kind of stuff. Why did you originally decide to task them in 2008 as the Bush administration was winding down? And what role do they play in the national security transition from an outgoing president to an incoming president? So give us a little bit of context for how unique these documents are and what role they play.
Well, it really started with President Bush early in 2008, maybe even a little earlier. And he looked at what was going to happen at the end of 2008. There would be a new president, and soon it was either going to be John McCain or it was going to be Barack Obama. Either way, the president said to Josh Bolten, who was his chief of staff, we are going to be passing to this new administration two ongoing wars, one in Afghanistan and Iraq. We're going to have the war on terror. There is still a terrorist threat to this country. There are all kind of other issues, dealing with problems with Russia, China, and we were about to enter in the most severe economic and financial crisis since the Great Depression. This is a lot to pass on to a new president and their team. And so he said, I want us to do everything we can to prepare them to be able to take on these responsibilities from day one. And so Josh Bolten was given the charge to run it, and he did. And he told us to develop a transition in the national security side. And what the memos were to do was to provide a context, and they all had the same format. What did we find? What was our strategy? What did we accomplish? What remained to be done? And then as attachments to all of these memos, there were the various policy documents, presidential statements, memos of conversations he had with foreign leaders, records of NSC meetings, all the things that would document the strategy. And when we put it all together, it was about two boxes worth of stuff. And we thought it would be a foundation for the kind of informal conversations we would have as the outgoing staff met the incoming staff. Mm-hmm. So that was really the source of it. And I think I hope it served its purpose. What we decided, I recalled these memos as being a very good statement, not only to prepare the Obama administration, but a good record of what the Bush administration had done. So about 3-4 years ago, I went down to the Bush Library and I read them, and they were as good as I remembered. So I asked the president about this operation, this task, whether he would be willing to support it, and he did. And it helped to get them declassified that Will Inboden advised us, and that the former president of the United States requested that the memos be declassified. So some materials that normally wouldn't get declassified for decades are here out 15 years.
So, yeah, I will say, and President Bush and Steve showed great leadership and initiative on that. Admiral, good to see you. So, speaking of national security icons, Admiral.
There you are.
No problem. As Steve mentioned, normally documents like this, many were either secret or top secret, wouldn't be declassified until our grandkids are around, 2050, 2060, something like that. And so to push to get them declassified really just about 15 years after the fact was pretty remarkable. And so for those of you interested in those issues of classification, secrecy, transparency, these are also an interesting case study. And something else to add an emphasis on what Steve was talking about on trying to pass on the knowledge and institutional memory that the Bush administration had developed to the incoming Obama team. It's something not always fully appreciated, but in a democracy like the United States, committed to the peaceful transfer of power, there is that kind of delicate 2.5-month window between election day, when the new president is elected, and then inauguration day, when the new president is sworn in, where the outgoing president is still president up until noon or 11:59 a.m. on January 20th, inauguration day. And then the incoming president does not become president until taking the oath of office, but is trying to prepare his, maybe eventually her team to take the reins of power. But during that window, 2.5 months, threats to America don't stop. Our alliances don't stop. CIA, covert actions don't necessarily stop. Military operations don't stop. Sensitive diplomatic negotiations don't necessarily stop. They may be adjusted a little bit. And so it's a major undertaking for the most powerful government, the most powerful country in the world, to hand over all of those operations and initiatives and assets and resources to the new commander-in-chief and diplomat-in-chief and first customer of the intelligence community and all that. And it's nothing we should take for granted, and the most recent one showed that this can be a rather fraught enterprise. And so even if you have an outgoing Republican and an incoming Democrat or vice versa, it's really the patriotic duty of both teams to ensure as smooth a handover as possible, especially because the vast majority of people in our government working on national security are career professionals, career uniform military, career diplomats, career CIA officers. So it's a very, very important but often less understood moment. All right, Steve, turning back to a lot of the substance and content of these memos. The world of 2008, 15 years ago now, in some ways seems long ago, and in other ways quite recent, at least to some of us. What did the world look like at the time to you as you were preparing this transition, this handover, looking back on the Bush administration's policies, trying to provide as many resources and insights to the Obama team? I mean, what were some of the biggest foreign policy challenges facing the United States in the fall of 2008, beginning of 2009?
Really, what was most remarkable, I think, was how different the context was at 2008 when we left office and 2000 when we came into office. When we came into office, the country, I think, in terms of its foreign policy, was still overwhelmed by the euphoria of the end of the 20th century, because liberal democracy had prevailed against fascism in World War II, prevailed against communism in the Cold War. And what emerged really was the United States, which was clearly the preeminent power in the world. It was an international order that was based on American and Western values of freedom, democracy, and market economies. It seemed unchallenged. It seemed for one of the few times in history when great power competition was almost a thing of the past. Russia and China at that point in time really were talking about it being incorporated in the international system rather than trying to overturn it. And the American approach to governance of free market capitalism and political democracy seemed to emerge at the end of that period as the only really viable and successful model for how people should organize societies. So, we were on a huge roll. By the end of 2008, a lot of things had changed. We had the beginnings of the reemergence of great power competition, with a resentful and increasingly revanchist Russia emerging, and China emerging as a very strong power and beginning to throw its weight around, if you will. Authoritarianism had a resurgence and offered itself as an alternative to democracy as a political organizing principle. Russia and China began to challenge that international system. And the United States power, while it had not declined, in relative terms, it had declined. China had grown, and you saw the rise of the middle powers of countries like Brazil and Indonesia and India and the like, who are playing an increasing role in our foreign affairs today. So I think in some sense, 2000, when we left office, looked like a long time ago in terms of the context for policy and the context in which the Obama administration would then have to work.
And of course, one of the defining events and defining challenges of the Bush administration and indeed our new century were the 9/11 attacks. And then out of that, of course, President Bush and his team developed the Bush Doctrine. So what were the main pillars of the Bush Doctrine? And then what does this volume reveal about it?
Well, there's a lot of talk about that, and it has various formulations, but it draws on these kinds of elements. First, the president made a decision we were going to take the fight to the enemy abroad so we didn't have to fight him here at home. So when the Taliban refused to hand over al-Qaeda and refused to destroy their base of operations in Afghanistan, the president went in and overturned Taliban and routed the al-Qaeda. So the first principle was we're going to take the fight to the enemy abroad so we don't have to fight him here at home. Second one was, if you harbor a terrorist, you're going to be treated as a terrorist. So it's not just the terrorists, it was to go after the infrastructure of financing and other support that kept terrorists alive. Third was that the president believed that we were not going to let threats linger. When we saw them, we were going to deal with them, if necessary, preemptively. We did not see 9/11 coming. And, 19 people armed with box cutters killed almost 3,000 people from over 70 countries. We didn't see it coming. Imagine if they had come with some kind of weapons of mass destruction. The president wasn't going to wait for that. Another element was that we had to respond and delegitimize the ideology of the terrorists and offer an alternative. And that was, of course, an alternative where people build societies based on freedom and democracy. So those were the main elements. And I guess the other one, which as a child of the 60s, I was amazed at how successful the president was, but he said very clearly, terrorism and violence against innocent civilians is never justified by any cause or creed. I grew up in the 60s where there was a lot of justifications for violence. And he basically said that's a thing of the past and won pretty broad acceptance for that principle. So he established a framework in which we were to wage this war on terror, and he decided it was a war. It wasn't a law enforcement matter. It was a war. It was going to require the resources and rules of conflict in order to manage it. And I think the bottom line was this. The intelligence community said after 9/11 that it was likely that this was going to be the first of a series of mass casualty attacks, some of which could involve weapons of mass destruction. And the great tribute to the American people and to the government and to multiple administrations is that that prediction did not come true. And we have not had a major terrorist attack since 9/11 in the subsequent 20 years. And that's a real success.
Yeah. And not to put too fine a point on that, but with the passing of time and looking back with hindsight, we can induce a certain complacency, like, well, maybe we are exaggerating the terrorist threat, or of course they wouldn't hit us again. But I have a very vivid memory, from being in D.C. on 9/11 and right afterwards. The widespread assumption all of us had was it's not a matter of if we get hit again, it's a matter of when we will get hit again. It just seemed inevitable. And of course, there was that very acute fear that next time it might not just be box cutters, right? Next time it might be, any number of chemical, biological, or possibly even nuclear agents. And so the threat calculation, the risk calculus, and the radical uncertainty made for a very, very challenging policy-making environment.
And I should say one thing, we have an enormous debt to those intelligence officers, those men and women in uniform, some of whom are in this audience, who defended this country against terrorism and helped keep it safe. And we owe them a huge debt of gratitude.
Yes, amen to that. Steve, something you mentioned just in passing when we were talking about the Bush Doctrine, is the subject of the first memo and first chapter in this book, and that is the Freedom Agenda. What was it? What were its main assumptions and principles? And then how do you think it's fared over the 15 years since the Bush administration left office?
So this is a long subject. I'll try to summarize it. Why is it
PhD students here looking for dissertation topics? So here
you go. Here you go. Why is it the first chapter in the book? Because it's where the president started. The president really had an enormous faith in humanity and in people. And he felt that people are best positioned to make decisions for their own futures and the futures of their children and grandchildren. And in order for them to do so, they had to be freed from violence, from political oppression, and from the tyrannies of ignorance and ill health and poverty. And that was his belief. And it was reflected both in his foreign policy and his domestic policy. If you remember, No Child Left Behind and educational reform, that was, again, taking young children and empowering them to be citizens and make decisions for their own lives through education. In terms of the foreign policy side, he really felt that we needed to encourage democratic states ruling with the consent of their people, and that those states would be able to provide security and prosperity for their people, would be states that would live in peace with their neighbors, could best meet the needs of their own people, and could cooperate with us in maintaining the international system. Now, on some level, that sounds like, a great idealism run riot, if you will. But the president also thought that it was a very realistic approach, precisely because states of that character would not go to war with each other, would not support terror, would try to meet the needs of the people, and would be part of ours. And it's one of the insights he had. There's this great debate about whether American foreign policy should be realist, driven by American interests, or idealist, driven by American values. In my life experiences, anytime someone tells you it's either or, it's always wrong, because it's some of both. And the president's view was the most realistic way to achieve our interests was going to be to pursue our ideals. And he very much believed that. But it was also not unhinged idealism in another sense. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal here a week or so ago that was very critical of President Wilson. Wilsonianism is associated with the idealistic notion of Americans should be committed to values. And he criticized it on the grounds that it didn't work. President Bush basically said, we want to advance our values, democracy, freedom, rule of law, respect for human rights. But in order to achieve a world based on those values, we need a balance of power that favors freedom. We need to muster the political, diplomatic, economic, and military might of ourselves and our democratic friends and allies who are committed to a freedom agenda to try to advance those interests in the world. That's how you would build a world that both served American interests of security and prosperity, but also was consistent with American values of freedom and democracy.
So, if I can add a couple of further thoughts on that, again, to give some context to the time and on its origins. The first is every president faces the challenge of trying to discern the times, trying to ascertain the structural forces in world affairs, the global trends that seem to be going on, identify the ones that may be worrisome or damaging to the United States and maybe mitigate them, then identify the ones that may be favorable to us and try to encourage or accelerate them. in, especially kind of 2003, 2004, 2005, we had a series of what are now became known as the color revolutions, right? So Ukraine, the Orange Revolution, 2004, and quite relevant for today, effort by the Ukrainians to, throw off the shackles of Russian meddling and control and claim their democracy for their own. Rose Revolution in Georgia, Cedar Revolution in Lebanon. What was the one in Kyrgyzstan? The Tulip Revolution?
Tulip Revolution.
Yeah. And so as these global trends start going, and President Bush sees these and rightly recognizes that these are favorable, it makes sense for American foreign policy to try to support and encourage them. But there's also this is again coming out of 9/11, the president recognized as we're wrestling with what are some of the root causes of terrorism. Why is it that 15 of the 19 hijackers came from Saudi Arabia, a pretty obviously repressive Islamic theocracy? And I encourage all of you to take a look back at November of 2003. President Bush gives a speech to the National Endowment for Democracy. And in it, he essentially predicts the Arab Spring. He says, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, but it's focusing on a lot of the autocracies and the corruption and the governance maladies afflicting the Middle East. He says, for too long, American foreign policy has tried to purchase stability at the price of liberty, and we're getting neither. And he points out that a number of these dictatorships in the broader Middle East were brittle. We're not responsive to the needs of their people. We're relying more on repression rather than legitimacy. And he basically says, this is not sustainable, right? This is not sustainable. There's too much of a boiling cauldron there. He didn't want to see violent revolutions or anything like that. But in diagnosing the ills there, like I said, I think it's remarkably prescient that 7 years later, almost to the day, Mohamed Bouazizi, the Tunisian fruit vendor, sets himself aflame, and that starts the cascade of the Arab Spring revolution. Many of them have not turned out very well, but it was, like I said, I think very prescient to identify that.
But it's not over. And you asked the question, where are we on the freedom agenda today? Mm-hmm. So 2003, 4, and 5, for the revolutions that Will talked about, we thought we were on a roll. President Mubarak has a relatively free and fair presidential election in Egypt. He subsequently then throws in jail the person who ran against him. Well, never mind that. No, seriously. So we thought we were on a roll. And then the empire struck back, to use a Star Wars phrase. And the authoritarians had their day. And if you look at the Freedom House Index of Freedom, it's been in decline ever since. The 9/11, the Arab Spring happens. There's a lot of hope that it's going to lead to a real transformation of the Middle East and democratic market economy states emerging. It doesn't happen. And a lot of people say, the freedom agenda was a mistake. Bush misread the Middle East. And I would simply say this, it's not over. It's not over. The vision of a more prosperous, democratic, and free Middle East catches on in the Middle East, particularly on women and young people. And so in 2018 and 2019, Bouteflika is overthrown in Algeria by popular protests. There is street protests that change governments in Iraq, Lebanon, and Jordan. And Bashir is overthrown in Sudan. So the jury is out on where this struggle for freedom will go in the Middle East. And we've all had a reminder in terms of Ukraine that people are willing to fight and die for their freedom and to avoid tyranny. And that's what the Ukrainians are doing and resisting the Russian aggression. And I think it's reminded a lot of people of the importance of a world that is based on freedom and democracy rather than a world that's based on authoritarians. What do we have in Putin? An authoritarian, increasingly authoritarian at home, who is trying to change the international system and invades his neighbors and oppresses his people. That is not the future we want. And the Ukrainians, it's the future they're fighting against today.
Yeah, very important points. The story is not over yet. So, Steve, with the hindsight of history, what do you regard as the Bush administration's most significant foreign policy accomplishments? And this is a softball, but we'll ask a couple that are more critical too, so stay with us. All right.
Right. Well, one has to be getting the country on a footing to be able to deal with the threat of terrorism and belie those predictions from the intelligence community. A second one, I think, that doesn't get much attention, in the same way he established new institutions and procedures for dealing with terrorism, he did the same thing with respect to the issue of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, particularly weapons of mass destruction to terrorists. Put in a whole set of procedures and institutions and processes to try to deal with that problem. And in the period since 2001, there has not been a new nuclear weapon state. And we are not aware of any terrorist organization that has achieved access to a nuclear weapon or the fissile material required to create one. That doesn't solve the problem of North Korea and Iran, who are pursuing, in the case of Iran, and have nuclear weapons in the case of North Korea. But those are problems that 4 administrations have struggled with. I think some things people have not paid attention to, and just briefly, one, bringing India into a strategic relationship with the United States, which is very increasingly important as we deal with China. A general support for our allies both in Europe and in Asia, in the event efforts to bring China and Russia into the international system failed. Lots of stuff in the developing world nobody pays any attention to. A new theory of development that is in partnership with the local countries and insists on results and measurable results in developing the developed world. Initiatives to deal with HIV/AIDS, malaria, various tropical diseases, and to end conflicts on Africa. 6 major conflicts in Africa were put to bed and resolved during his tenure. So I think that's a list of some of the things that people have not paid attention to, which I think are remarkable accomplishments. And one of the purposes of this book, you know, the Bush administration, if you say, what did the Bush administration do? You'll say, well, it did Iraq, Afghanistan, and the war on terror. And one of the lessons of this book is this administration and any administration is doing a lot of things across the full range of foreign policy and national security issues at the same time. And it needs to, because if we don't attend to those issues, it will threaten the peace and security ultimately of people here at home.
All right, so in a similar vein, as we're grading ourselves here, what do you regard as the Bush administration's biggest disappointments, mistakes, missteps?
So I'm running on a little bit. I'm going to outline them, and you can decide which ones you want to come back to.
And we'll blame them all on the State Department. Right.
No, we won't. Okay. It's one of the things about the NSC, we used to say that if something goes well, it's to the credit of either the president or the relevant cabinet secretary. And if something went poorly, it's because the NSC failed to coordinate the rest of the government. So, you know, we don't take credit for any of this, but some of the blame we do have to take credit for.
Or CIA failed to warn us. Okay.
That's another matter.
Okay. Yeah.
One, our reach exceeded our grasp. We weren't able to bring Russia and China into the international system. We weren't able to bring a democratic transformation to the Middle East. There are a lot of other things that we tried to do and were not successful. We did not get rid of the nuclear programs of North Korea and Iran. We had agreements in each case in which they were going to give up the pursuit of nuclear weapons, and they reneged in both cases. So our reach exceeded our grasp. We did not use all elements of our national power. We didn't have the civilian instruments to complement our military in order to stabilize post-conflict Iraq and Afghanistan. I think that was a weakness. As I said, our failure to bring Russia and Russia and China into the international system, failure to transform the Middle East. And one of the lessons I took that I didn't realize at the time, you know, when you think about Iraq, whatever you think about what we were doing there, obviously there is the failure to stabilize Iraq between 2003 and 2007 cost enormously in terms of lives and treasure of Americans, coalitions, partners, and Iraqis, first and foremost. And in that period of time, we lost leverage. Our success in Afghanistan and Iraq in 2001 and then 2003 caused, for example, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya to give up his weapons of mass destruction voluntarily, caused the Iranians to suspend in 2003 their nuclear efforts to get nuclear weapons. We were on a roll to, in some sense, roll up the proliferation problem. And as we got bogged down in Iraq and Afghanistan, both of those countries, both North Korea, which had begun to enter into negotiations, and Iran, got out of the agreements we had achieved with them to limit and eliminate their nuclear programs. So we lost a lot of leverage. And that's an additional opportunity cost. And, it took us a long time to figure out how to deal with the insurgency in Iraq, and the surge of beginning in 2007, in January 2007, was dramatically successful and a real tribute to our men and women in uniform and our intelligence officers who figured out how to bring that insurgency down to an acceptable level. But it came too late. It came too late.
Although on the surge, again, for those of you, maybe ancient history for many here, but Steve, I think, rightly pays tribute to our troops and intelligence officers, and then some of the State Department diplomats too. But just for the record, I think the person in some ways singly most responsible for developing the surge as a policy option and then getting it implemented was Steve Hadley, and it's a great case study on the National Security Advisor going beyond merely the policy coordination role, but actually getting into the policy development role. And again, it's national security advisors have multiple hats to wear, while also being very attentive to serving the president.
So, well, this is much too serious, this conversation. So I want to tell two stories, if I can, or at least one anecdote and story. One, it's very hard for people to recreate what it was like after 9/11. And why the Bush administration did some of the things it did. And so I went back and I got a publication from the Director of National Intelligence, which gives you a chronology of terrorist events globally for the last 20 years. And I took the period after 9/11 through the end of 2002. And by my count, in the world, there were 38 terrorist events in 13 countries that killed scores of people and wounded scores more. And it's almost a drumbeat. When you were in the White House at that time, every 3 or 4 weeks, there would be a terrorist attack. So, the pressure to do something about that problem was great. And the pressure of keeping the president safe was also great. And for a period of time, the Secret Service would come in and say, into the Oval Office, and they'd say, Mr. President, we have a terrorist threat and we need to take you down to the president's emergency facility where you'd be secure. And in some cases, they wanted to move him out of the White House altogether. He went along with it for the first 10 days, disrupted, pulled out of the Oval Office for 2 or 3 times. And finally, they came to him and said, Mr. President, there's an unidentified airplane coming this way, and we think you need to get out of the Oval Office. And the president said, I'm staying here. And if bin Laden is looking for me, this is where he can find me. That kind of defiance and leadership was terribly important at that time.
Yes. You obviously, when we were talking about some of the Bush administration's failings, you had mentioned Iraq, both the failings on stabilization, reconstruction, but also some of the knock-on effects of how lost momentum, an important reminder of how credibility matters in international politics. But when the Bush administration is discussed and its legacy is brought up, another point that critics will certainly focus on is the administration's detention and interrogation programs for terrorists, terrorist suspects. What are your reflections on that? And does this volume give us any new insights on that? So how do you answer those critics?
The volume doesn't talk a lot about that. You won't find a chapter on that. I try to cover it in the introduction to the terrorism chapter. The reason for that is it was so covered at the time, there was not much more to be said about it. But it goes to what I was trying to say before. It's very hard to put yourself in the situation that we felt we were in after this attack on 9/11, and a sense that we really weren't on top of the threat. We did not know all the things we needed to know about al-Qaeda if we were going to keep the country safe. So the president decided there were a number of measures, and there were three of them in particular, that he instituted, that we tried to be very careful to make sure they were within the law, because the president, as the principal law enforcement officer of the country, couldn't violate the law. But within the law were everything we could do to keep the country safe. And we knew they were controversial, and we knew that after the time of crisis passed, Americans might be uncomfortable with them. But the president decided we would do those things in order to keep the country safe. And once, about 2 years in, when we thought we had a handle on the threat and were going to be able to protect the country, we started to relax some of those measures. And a very curious thing began. It's a kind of American-style debate about how do you reach a consensus on a hard issue. And everybody gets into the act. The administration and the CIA are looking at their programs and seeing whether they can be de-scoped, and they gradually are. There are congressional hearings. There are congressional legislation. I negotiated with John McCain on the Detainee Treatment Act, which was a difficult negotiation, given that John McCain had been a prisoner of war and had been tortured in North Vietnam. So there are congressional hearings, there's congressional legislation, there are judicial decisions that begin to set up some guidelines. And there are, of course, press leaks, which bring issues to the American people, and the American people then offer their views on these things. And what happens over the course of the end of the Bush administration, into the Obama administration, and in some sense into the Trump administration, in this own peculiar American way, with all our institutions playing, we reach a consensus about what we're going to do and what we're not going to do in the face of terrorism to keep the country safe. And that's now enshrined in executive orders and legislation. We are helped by the fact that the threat of terrorism, while still there, is not, I would say, as strategic as it was in 2001 thereafter. But it's a good, I think, lesson in how the country is sort of deals with a difficult problem, variety of views, and finally, over time, reaches a consensus about how we're going to deal with a particular challenge.
Yes, and a good reminder too, and I often talk to my students about this when we are trying to, from the vantage point of history, go back and reevaluate decisions that leaders make. And I think an important principle then is try to look at what the world looked like to them at the time, not knowing what the future holds, but what the world looks like at the time, and what were the available options, what seemed to be the available options, and then how the costs and benefits of those were assessed. Doesn't by any means vindicate every decision a leader makes, but I think it provides, and sometimes it can even give you more basis to criticize a really bad decision if you see there were other available options. But it begins, I think, with some amount of at least empathy for what did it look like at the time, and then from there we can make the judgments.
Are we going to turn to them for some questions here?
Oh, but Steve, I enjoy hearing myself talk so much. All right, okay, yes, we will. One more from me. We're going to end on I think a positive note, at least in our discussion, then we'll turn it over to all of you. Next month marks the 20th anniversary of the start of the Iraq War. And obviously, a lot of commentary on that. We've discussed that some. But next week marks the 20th anniversary of the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. And you had made a passing reference to this. But given that we now are on the 20th anniversary of what's known as PEPFAR, by some measures, 25 million lives saved, $100 billion spent across, 4 administrations now. Tell us a little bit more about the origins of this ambitious plan, anything the book may highlight on it, and anything you want our audience to reflect on. And then we will get ready with your questions too.
So in 2001, 2002, we are getting reports, both from the intelligence community and from public sources, that the HIV/AIDS epidemic is unrestrained in Africa, and the devastation it's going to cause in Africa is astonishing. Basically, predictions that 60 to 70% of the middle class in some countries was going to be wiped out by HIV/AIDS. You think about what impact that would set back development in those countries for generations. the fatality figures were astronomical, and the capacity to prevent and treat in Africa was very small. And the president decided that the United States needed to do something about that. This is part of the idealistic strange in him. He used to keep saying, "To whom much is given, much is required." And Mike Gerson, the late Mike Gerson, was particularly active in pushing the president on this. So the president turned to his chief of staff, Josh Bolton, and Gary Edson, who was on part of the NSC staff, and said, "Give me a plan to help out dealing with HIV/AIDS in Africa." And they gave him a plan, which is a respectable plan. And he said, and this is an example, I think, one of the things from the book is how often it is the president that initiates or conceptualizes an initiative or a project, a policy, and then actually is intimately involved in the implementation. The president says, it's not ambitious enough. Go back and do it over. And they come back with another plan that involves a combination of treatment and prevention and care. And it's a big dollar amount. And the president then takes that plan and he internationalizes it. He gets the G7 committed to do it. He gets the UN Global Fund stood up. So he takes a US initiative and makes it a global initiative. And the impact it had on Africa was transformational. Because it's not just 25 million lives saved, but it was also the preservation of this middle class. And in Africa today now that economically has a lot of promise. Interestingly enough, the president did the same thing with respect to malaria. On another presidential initiative, that is estimated to have saved about 10 million lives in Africa. And it's interesting, politically he was willing to do it while HIV/AIDS was a problem Americans knew, because Americans were suffering from it here at home, and there were various programs of the government to try to help with that. Malaria was a disease that had been eliminated in the United States 2 decades earlier at least. But the president felt it was important to make that contribution, that America could make that contribution, and convince the American people that it was the right thing to do. These initiatives, I think, are the best kept secrets in terms of the Bush administration. And it's unfortunate because the American people should be extremely proud of what their government and their money did for the continent of Africa. And Americans may have forgotten, but I tell you, the Africans have not.
Yeah. And also a good example of how presidents can show leadership, and it's not just about responding to public opinion. There were not, large, clamoring or upswell of demand from the American people to, spend these billions of dollars. A lot of them just didn't know about it, especially on malaria. But part of the role of a president, of course, is to educate and inform the public on where there are needs and opportunities and where the United States can make a difference. And then in turn, the American people rallied to it and through Congress said, yes, we will, send our tax dollars here. We want to make a difference.
So one other lesson about that. The president wanted from the very beginning to make it bipartisan so that it would survive the end of his administration. And one of the lessons I think from that is if you want a policy that is going to be sustained, you have to do the hard work and make it bipartisan from the start. If you enact it by a party line vote, the next time your party loses, the next party will come in and by a party line vote will vote it out. So, consensus is a lot of work, but if you want a sustainable policy, it's worth the effort.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.